Hello, everyone. We have already taken a look at Chinese immigration and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And as you know, the vast majority of Chinese immigrants were on the West Coast in California. And now we're going to look at immigration of Irish people to America. Happened around the same time in the mid-1800s and for different reasons, but very similar reasons. And you'll find that the Irish were actually treated as pretty much as badly as the Chinese were treated. And here we go. First, pause this video and watch the video that is embedded on Schoology, Irish Immigration to the United States. When you are done watching this video, come back to this one. Alright, so I trust you've seen that video. We're just going to talk a little bit more about the Irish in America. About 10% or 33 million Americans at this time claim full or partial Irish ancestry. But at one time, this would have been unthinkable because the Irish, much like the Chinese, were considered by many to be less than the people already here. As you saw in the video with the clip from Gangs of New York, there was a nativist movement that was very much anti-Irish. That doesn't mean it was everyone, but it was a prevalent belief, and of course there are varying levels of hatred for the Irish, just like now there are varying levels of hatred and distrust for current immigrant groups. So a lot of this mistrust and hatred and believing they were less than was based largely upon the Irish being of the Catholic faith and their utter poverty upon arrival in this country. Protestants in America were often mistrustful of Catholics, believing they'd be more loyal to the Pope than to the United States. This goes back to Britain being mostly Protestant and Ireland being mostly Catholic, and some ancient distrust between those two countries. The Irish immigrants' poverty was directly caused by harsh British rule of Ireland, coupled with the potato famine that brought people over here in desperation. Over here, we have this illustration, this political cartoon from the 1850s depicting a poorhouse, which is where people who are absolutely destitute would go. Literally in a house on a boat full of people. It's called the Poor House from Galway, sailing over to America. And it illustrates the belief that Ireland was sending the most destitute of its citizens to the United States. So eventually the Irish do manage to climb up the economic ladder. Over the decades, they managed to transition from being at the bottom of the social ladder to climbing to the top. This culminated with the election of John F. Kennedy, our president, in 1961. He was our first Irish and Catholic president. Unfortunately, the Irish rise to the top was often at the expense of other immigrant groups, because sometimes people found that when you put other people down, it makes you go up. But that's just the history of this country, and we have to understand that. So, the Irish and the Chinese immigrants did have a lot in common. From the time they arrived until they were able to assimilate with the white population, the Irish community did suffer from mistreatment similar to Chinese immigrants suffering. They were often thought of as inhuman, and often in political cartoons they were drawn to be ape-like or simian. They worked in harsh conditions for little pay, and although they were never excluded from immigrating to the U.S., their presence was barely tolerated. If you take a look on the internet for No Irish Need Apply signs, you'll also see No Dogs and No Irish. So the Irish did have a lot of trouble finding work, which of course kept them in poverty which of course is one of the reasons people wouldn't hire them. It's a vicious circle. So partly because of their fair skin and a lot of other reasons, the Irish were eventually absorbed into the white racial category, unlike their Chinese counterparts. So the Irish were able to become white and enjoy a lot of privilege because of that, but it did take a while and they did suffer greatly before that. So over here, we have an 1800s political cartoon that portrayed the Irish as ape-like, drunk, and violent. These stereotypes persisted, and some still exist, although they have less power to harm in modern times because the Irish have ascended to pretty high social ranking. All right, so we have 2 articles we're going to read. I'm going to read them out loud with you. This first one this comes from the Library of Congress, called Adaptation and Assimilation. The Irish immigrants left a rural lifestyle in a nation lacking modern industry. Many immigrants found themselves unprepared for the industrialized urban centers in the United States. Though these immigrants were not the poorest people in Ireland, the poorest were unable to raise the required sum for steerage passage on a ship to America. By American standards, they were destitute. They often had no money beyond the fare for their passage, and thus settled in the ports of their debarkation. That means the ports where they arrived. In time, the sum total of Irish Americans exceeded the entire population of Ireland. New York City boasted more Irishmen than Dublin, Ireland. The Irish established patterns that newcomers to the United States continue to follow today. Housing choices, occupations entered, financial support to families remaining in the homeland, and chain immigrations which brought additional relatives to America are some of these patterns. Irish immigrants often crowded into subdivided homes that were intended for single families, living in tiny cramped spaces. Cellars, attics, and make-do spaces in alleys became home. Not only were many immigrants unable to afford better housing, but the mud huts in which many had lived in Ireland had lowered their expectations. A lack of adequate sewage and running water in these places made cleanliness next to impossible. Disease of all kinds, including cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, and mental illness, resulted from these miserable living conditions. So cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis are obviously diseases that you can get from unclean situations, and mental illness would be brought on because of the mental stress and strain of their living conditions. Thus, when the Irish families moved into neighborhoods, other families moved out, fearing the real or imagined dangers of disease, fire hazards, unsanitary conditions, and the social problems of violence, alcoholism, and crime. How might the living conditions of the Irish have influenced their acceptance in the United States? How do living patterns of new immigrant groups affect their acceptance in the U.S. today? Who determines these patterns or conditions? Those are important questions to think about. All right. Next section that we need to read is called Joining the Workforce. Irish immigrants often entered the workforce at the bottom of the occupational ladder and took on the menial and dangerous jobs that were often avoided by other workers. Many Irish women became servants or domestic workers, while many Irish men labored in coal mines and built railroads and canals. Railroad construction was so dangerous that it was said, "There was an Irishman buried under every tie." Now that is not literal, that's figurative. There was not actually an Irishman buried under every tie. As Irish immigrants moved inland from eastern cities, they found themselves in heated competition for jobs. The audio recording Immigrant Laborers in the Early 20th Century describes how West Virginia coal operators fired union laborers and gave the jobs to Irish, Italian, and African American workers because, quote, "the coal company owned them," end quote. This competition heightened class tensions, and at the turn of the century, Irish Americans were often antagonized by organizations such as the American Protective Association and the Ku Klux Klan. The Irish often suffered blatant or subtle job discrimination. Furthermore, some businesses took advantage of Irish immigrants' willingness to work at unskilled jobs for low pay. Employers were known to replace or threaten to replace uncooperative workers and those demanding higher wages with Irish laborers. Over time, many Irish climbed occupational and social ladders through politically appointed positions such as policeman, fireman, and teacher. Second and third generation Irish were better educated, wealthier, and more successful than were their parents and grandparents, as illustrated by the Kennedy family. That would be the family of President John F. Kennedy. The first Kennedy who arrived in the U.S. in 1848 was a laborer. His son had modest success in the country, but his grandson, college-educated Joseph P. Kennedy, made the fortune that enabled the great-grandsons, one of whom became President John F. Kennedy, to achieve great political success. Okay, end of presentation.